Expecting Someone Taller by Tom Holt. Chapter 14. Malcom did not know where the others were, nor did he care much. He only knew that Ortlind had gone. She had packed her suitcase, said goodbye, and walked down the drive, and for all Malcom knew, he would never see her again. Of course, he could not accept this. It seemed incredible that it could all be over, and at the back of his mind he felt sure that it was only a meaningless interruption to an inevitable happy ending. The girl loved him. He loved her. Surely that ought to be enough to be going on with. But she had gone away, and the part of his mind that still dealt with reality told him that it was forever. The room in which he had chosen to sit had not been used for many years. There were dust sheets over several pieces of furniture, and he tried to imagine what they looked like under their protective covers. There was half a tune he had heard in New York drumming away in his head. It was not a tune with any emotional or nostalgic significance, but it was there, like a fly trapped behind a windscreen, and he sat and listened to its endless repetitions for a while. In front of him were 10 or 15 sheets of paper on which he'd started to write many drafts of the letter that would set everything straight. But the right words somehow eluded him, like a cat that refuses to come in when called. He could concentrate on nothing, and his eyes focused of their own accord on the walls and corners of the room. "There you are," said a girl's voice behind him. "I've been looking for you everywhere." He knew even before he looked round that it was only Flosshilde. He said nothing. He did not resent her intrusion. Nothing could matter less. He imagined that she would say something or other and then go away again. Flosshilde sat in the window seat and put her feet up on a chair. "You don't mind me being here, do you?" she said. "No," he replied. "I wanted to get away from the others. They were being awfully stuffy about something." Malcom said nothing. He did not believe in the existence of anything outside this room, except of course for Ortlind, and he wasn't allowed to think about her any more. "Do you want to talk about it?" Flosshilde asked. "No," said Malcom. "I didn't think you would. She was rather beautiful, wasn't she?" "She isn't dead, you know," said Malcom irritably. "She still is rather beautiful for all I know." "What made you change your mind?" "I had to do something. That seemed better than the other thing. I don't know. I did what I thought was for the best." "I think you're right, if that's any help." "No, of course it isn't. I'm sorry. I'll be quiet now." "You can talk if you like," Malcom said. "It wasn't bothering me." "Can you play pontoon?" "No." "I'll teach you if you like." "No, thanks." "I know a game where you can take a piece of writing, anything will do, and each letter has a number. A is 1, B is 2, and so on, and you play odds against evens. Each sentence is a new game, and the side that wins gets 5 points for each sentence. Odds usually win, for some reason. That's what I do when I'm feeling unhappy. It takes your mind off things." Malcom wasn't listening, and Flosshilde felt like a castaway on a desert island who sees a ship sailing by without taking any notice of his signals. Perhaps it would be better, she thought, if she went away, but she stayed where she was. "Shall I tell you a story about the time when the giant stole Donna's hammer and he had to dress up in drag to get it back?" "If you like." She told the story, doing all the voices and putting in some new bits she hadn't thought of before. It was a very funny story, but Malcom simply sat and looked out the window. Flosshilde wanted to cry, or at the very least hit him, but she simply sat there too. "I want your advice," she said. "I don't think it'd be worth much." "Never mind. One of my sisters is dotty about a man, and he's dotty about a girl, and she doesn't fancy him at all. What should she do?" "Are you being funny?" Malcom asked bitterly. "No, really. What do you think she should do about it?" "Grow up and get on with something useful." "I see. Aren't you sorry for her?" "I suppose so. But I'm not really in the mood just now." He turned away and looked at the wall. "I'm sorry," said Flosshilde. "I'll shut up now." She studied her fingernails, which were the best in the world. King Arthur had often complimented her on her fingernails. "Would you like me to go and talk to her?" Flosshilde said after a long silence. "Who?" "Ortlind, silly. Perhaps there's something I could say." "I thought you couldn't stand her. Why is that, by the way?" "Oh, I don't know," lied Floshild. "We quarrelled about something a long time ago." "Tell me about her. You probably know her a lot better than I do." "Not really," Floshild said. "I've known her on and off for years, of course, but only very generally. I find it pretty hard to tell those sisters apart, to be honest." "Are they all like her? Her sisters, I mean?" "Very. Ortlin's probably the nicest looking, now that Brunhild's, and Grimgurd's quite pretty too, in a rather horrid sort of way. Big round eyes, like a cow." "I'm not really interested in her sisters. She said that the rest of them were all much nicer than she was, but I don't believe her. What did you quarrel about?" "I honestly can't remember. It can't have been anything important. Is there anything at all I can do?" "No," said Malcolm. "Perhaps you'd better go. I'm not in a very good mood, I'm afraid." Floshild took her feet daintily off the chair and walked out of the room. Once she had closed the door safely behind her, she shut her eyes and closed her hands tightly. It didn't help at all, and if she screamed, somebody would hear her. She went downstairs. From the landing, she could hear an excited buzz of voices in the drawing room. Albrecht and Erda and someone else, whose voice was vaguely familiar. The newcomer turned out to be the middle Norn, a round, fair-haired woman in a smart brown tweed suit. She had brought a huge briefcase with her, and the floor was covered with photocopies of ancient parchments. Erda and the Norn were down on their knees going over them with magnifying glasses, while Albrecht was at the desk taking notes. "And she married Sintolt the Hedgeling," the Norn was saying, "and their son was Ormanric." "What's going on?" Floshild asked. "There has been a rather singular development," said Erda, looking up from the papers on the floor. She had fluff from the carpet all over her jacket. "We have succeeded in tracing the last of the Volsungs." "Really?" said Floshild. She wasn't in the least fascinated, for it scarcely seemed to matter now. Still, it would be something to do. If she got bored, she could play her word game. "I think you'll be surprised when you hear it," continued Mother Earth. "Let me just go through the stammer for you." "Don't bother on my account," said Floshild. "I'll take your word for it." She sat down and picked up a magazine. "Just tell me the name." "There are 3 living descendants in a direct line," said the Norn, taking off her spectacles. "Mrs. Eileen Fisher of Sydney, Australia, her daughter Bridget, also of Sydney, and her son Malcom of Coombe Hall, Somerset." In an instant, Floshild was kneeling beside them. She bullied the Norn into going over every link in the complex genealogical chain, which spanned over 1,000 years. The descent was indeed direct, from Siegfried the Volsung, Fafner's Bane, to Bridget and Malcolm Fisher. "I hurried over as soon as I found out," said the Norn. "Of course you know what this means." "No," admitted Floshild breathlessly. "Go on." "Well," said the Norn, putting back her spectacles, "Siegfried was, at least in theory, a subject of the Gibichung crown when he married Gudrun. Certainly Sieghild was a Gibichung subject, and so the ring, if we accept that it was Siegfried's legitimate property, is subject to Gibichung law in matters of inheritance. Gibichung law is of course very complicated, and on the subject of testament it verges on the arcane, but it so happens that I have made a special study of the subject." The Norn paused, as if expecting some words of praise. None were forthcoming. "Anyway, hereditary as opposed to acquired property cannot, under Gibichung law, pass to the female heirs, but is only transmitted through them to the next male heir. That is to say, to the female it is inalienable, and she has no right to assign or dispose of it. She can only keep it in trust until the next male heir comes of age at 14 years. "What are you going on about?" said Floshild. "Although his mother is still alive, and his sister is older than him, Malcolm Fisher is, according to Gibichung law, the rightful heir to the Nibelung's ring." "Which ring?"
"My bloody ring," said Albrecht impatiently. "Your ring, the ring. Look, if we're going to be all legal about this."
"Human law," said Mother Earth loftily, "has no bearing on property that is or has been owned or held by a god. Since the Volsung race is descended from gods and is therefore semi-divine, and since the ring was, if only for the space of a few hours, once held by the gods Wotan and Logi, the ring is subject only to divine law."
Oh, said the Norn, clearly disappointed. Never mind, then. Under divine law, said the Mother Earth, property descends by primogeniture alone. Mrs. Eileen Fisher, Mr. Fisher's mother, and the eldest surviving Volsung is therefore the legitimate legal heir to the Nibelung's ring. What about me? Shouted Albrecht.
And me, said Floshild. It was ours to begin with, remember?
The gold was, said Albrecht, but I made the bloody thing. I was about to say, said Mother Earth severely, that under divine law, right of inheritance is subordinate to right of conquest.
What?
Floshild was now utterly confused. It means, said Albrecht bitterly, that if I take something away from you, it becomes mine, and if they take something away from me, it becomes theirs. That's divine law. Marvellous, isn't it?
In other words, said the Norn triumphantly, it amounts to the same thing as Gibichung law. It belongs to Mr. Fisher.
There was a baffled silence as the four immortals pondered the significance of all this. Be that as it may, said Mother Earth at last, the fact remains that Malcom Fisher, if not the last of the Volsungs, is one of the last of the Volsungs. Certainly he is the most recent of the Volsungs, which is roughly the same thing, and as such is by birth and genetic programming one of the 3 most suitable people in the world to be the ring-bearer. God damn it, she added. Floshild could hardly contain her excitement.
Just wait till I tell him, she said. He'll be thrilled.
I hardly think it'd be suitable at this juncture. Floshild made a rude face and left the room. That child is scarcely helping matters, said Mother Earth.
Guess what, said Floshild, bursting into the room. You're a Volsung.
I'm sorry, Malcom said. Floshild told him everything, putting in explanations where she felt they would be necessary.
So you see, she said, you're not really human at all. You're one of us, and she is your cousin.
Malcom laughed. What a coincidence, he said sardonically.
But don't you care, said Floshild. You're virtually a god. You're descended from the world's greatest hero. Aren't you pleased?
No, said Malcom truthfully. I couldn't care less, to be honest with you. Of course I always knew there was something wrong with me, but now that I know what it is, I don't see that it's going to make a great deal of difference. He continued to stare out of the window.
Oh, for pity's sake!
Floshild was angry now. She had so wanted him to be pleased and excited, and he wasn't.
You're hopeless.
Very probably. And besides, from what you said, Bridget is the real Volsung, or the eldest, or whatever. That doesn't surprise me in the least. Judging by what I've heard about Siegfried lately, sounds like she takes after him a whole lot. Floshild knelt down beside him and put her hands on his elbows.
But she hasn't done what you've done. She hasn't made the world a wonderful place, or defeated Wotan. You have, all on your own. You're the real hero, much more than Siegfried was, even.
Really? Malcom shook his head. I don't think so. I've stopped living in a make-believe world, you see. Just finding out that I'm a make-believe person doesn't make any difference. It's not going to change anything.
But you don't understand.
That's the one thing I have got right, he said, looking straight at her. I do understand, and that's the only good thing that's come out of this whole rotten mess. I've been living in a world of my own, and...
But the world is your own,
Floshild almost shouted. Suddenly Malcom began to laugh, and Floshild lost all patience with him. As long as she lived, she told herself as she walked furiously out of the room, she would never understand humans. On the landing she met the Norn, who seemed agitated.
Call him, she said. Something terrible's happening.
Across the glittering plains, which stretch as far as the eye can see, from the steep rock on which the castle of Valhalla is built, Wotan had mustered the army of the storm. In their squadrons and regiments were assembled the light and dark elves, the spirits of the unquiet dead, and the horse of Hela. At the head of each regiment rode a Valkyrie, dressed in her terrifying armour, the very sight of which is enough to turn the wits of the most fearless of heroes. Around his shoulders Wotan cast the mantle of terror, and on his head he fastened the helmet that the dwarves had made him from the fingernails of dead champions in the gloomy caverns of Nibelung. He nodded his head, and Logi brought him the great spear Gungnir, the symbol and the source of all his power. When he had first come to rule the earth, he had cut its shaft from the branches of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that stands between the worlds, causing the tree to wither and die, and making it inevitable the final downfall of the gods. Onto this spear shaft, Logi had marked the runes of the great covenant between God and his subjects. Wotan raised his right hand, and the Valkyrie Waltraud, who causes the eyes of men slain in battle, led forward his 8-legged horse, the cloud-trampling Sleipnir. Above his head hovered 2 black ravens. "If you get mud on that saddle," said Waltraud, "you can clean it off yourself." Without a word, Wotan vaulted onto the back of his charger. As the first bolt of lightning ripped the black clouds, he brandished the great spear as a sign to his army, the Wotan here. It was over 1,000 years since the horse of Valhalla had ridden to war on the wings of the storm, and the world had forgotten how to be afraid. Like a vast cloud of locusts or a shower of arrows they flew, blotting out the light from the earth. At the head of the wild procession galloped Wotan. Behind him Donna, Tyr, Frau, Heimdall, Njord, Logi, who carried the banner of darkness. Close on their heels came the 8 Valkyries, Grimgerd, Waltraud, Sigrun, Helmwig, Ortlin, Schwertleid, Gerhild and Rosweis, baying like wolves to spur on the grim company that followed them, the terrible spirits of fear and discord. Each of the 8 companies bore its own hideous banner: hunger, war, disease, intolerance, ignorance, greed, hatred and despair. These were the badges of Wotan's army. Behind the army, like a pack of hounds intoxicated by the chase, followed the wind and the rain, lashing indiscriminately at friend and foe. Below them forests were flattened, towns and villages were swept away, even the mountains seemed to tremble and cower at the fury of their passing. With a rush they swept over the Norn fells and past the dead branches of the world ash. As they passed it, lightning fell among its withered leaves, setting it alight. Soon the whole fell was burning, and the flames hissed and swayed at the foot of Valhalla rock. As the army of the god of battles passed between the worlds, the castle itself caught fire and began to burn furiously, lighting up the whole world with a bright red glow. The army passed high over the frozen desert of the Arctic, convulsing the ice-covered waters with the shock of their motion, and flitted over Scandinavia like an enormous bird of prey, whose very shadow paralyses the helpless victim. As they wheeled and banked over Germany, the Rhine rose up as if to meet them, bursting its banks and flooding the flat plains between Essen and Nijmegen. Wotan, his whole form framed with the lightning, laughed when he saw it, and his laughter brought towers and cathedrals crashing to the ground. And as the army followed its dreadful course, black clouds of squeaking, gibbering spirits leapt up to swell its numbers, as all the dark, tormented forces of the earth were drawn as if by capillary action into the fold of the Lord of Tempests. The very noise of their wings was deafening, and when they swept low, the earth split open as if shrinking back in horror. But however vast and awesome this great force might seem, most terrible of all was Wotan, like a burning arrow at its head. As he flew headlong over the North Sea, the heat of his anger turned the waters to steam, and soon the forests of Scotland were blazing as brightly as Valhalla itself. As the army neared its goal, it seemed to concentrate into a cloud of tangible darkness, forcing its way through the air as it bore down like a meteor on one little village in the west of England. "What's going on?" shouted Malcom. The noise was unbearable, and through the splintered windows of the house a gale was blowing that nearly lifted him off his feet. "It's Wotan!" yelled Albrecht, his face white with fear. "He's coming with all his army!" "Is he indeed?" Malcom replied. "I want a word with him." All the lights had gone out, but the brilliance of the ball of fire that grew ever larger in the northern sky dazzled and stunned the watchers, so that even Mother Earth had to turn away. But Malcom walked calmly out of the shattered door and stood in the drive. His hair was unruffled, and his eyes were unblinking, and on his finger the ring felt easy and comfortable. Out of the immeasurable darkness that surrounded it, the awful light grew ever more fierce, until the very ground seemed to be about to melt. Like a falling sun, it hurtled towards the ruined house, straight at the ring-bearer like a diving falcon. "All right," said Malcolm sternly. "That will do." The light went out, and the world was plunged into utter darkness. A hideous scream cut through the air like a spear blade through flesh, and was held for an instant in the hollow of the surrounding hills. Then it died away, and the clouds slowly began to fall apart. Like a swarm of angry bees suddenly confounded by a puff of smoke, Wotan's armies sank out of the air and disintegrated. The black vapours dissolved, and the gentle light of the sun fell upon the surfaces of the wrecked and mangled planet. "And before you go," said Malcolm, "you can clear up all this mess." Like a film being wound back, the world began to reassemble itself. Smoke was dragged out of the air, back into the stumps of charred trees. Bricks and stones slipped back into place, and once more were houses. Glass reformed itself smoothly into panes, and the cracks faded away. The flooded rivers slid shamefacedly back between their banks, taking their silt with them, and the earth silently closed up its fissures. While this remarkable act of healing was taking place, a pale mist formed and hung in the still air above the surface of the world, and the light of the sun was caught and refracted by it into all the colours of the spectrum. Malcolm had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. "What is it?" he asked a passing dove. The bird looked puzzled for a moment. "Oh, that," it said at last. "That's just a test card." Malcolm shrugged his shoulders and walked back into the house. The drawing room seemed to be deserted, and Malcolm had come to the conclusion that everyone must have got bored and had gone away, when he heard a voice from under the table. "What happened?" said a voice. "Nothing," said Malcolm. "It's over now." Looking rather ashamed of herself, Mother Earth crawled out from her hiding place. "I dropped my goddamn glasses," she mumbled. "I was just looking for them." "Are you sure they're not in your pocket?" asked Malcolm sympathetically. Mother Earth made a dumb show of looking in her pocket, and not surprisingly, there they were. "Thank you," she said humbly. "You're welcome," said Malcolm. Albrecht and the middle Norn emerged from behind the sofa. To his amusement, Malcolm saw that Albrecht was holding the Norn's hand in a comforting manner. "There now," said the dwarf. "I told you it would be all right, didn't I?" The Norn beamed at him, her round face illuminated by some warm emotion. "I don't know what came over me," she said. "That was very clever," Albrecht said to Malcolm, forgetting to let go of the Norn's hand, even though the danger was past. "How did you manage it?" "What, that?" said Malcolm diffidently. "Oh, it was nothing, really." Albrecht and his new friend walked to the window. In the sky there was a deep red glow, which could have been the sunset were it not for the fact that it were due north. Albrecht looked at it for a long time. "I never did like them," he said at last. "Who?" Malcolm asked. "The gods," said Albrecht. Then he turned to the Norn. "You look like you could do with some fresh air," he said. "Do you fancy a stroll in the garden?" It seemed very probable that she did, and they walked away arm in arm. Malcolm shook his head sadly. "Who was that, by the way?" he asked Mother Earth, who was busily brushing the fluff of her jacket. "The middle Norn," said Mother Earth. "Doesn't she have a name?" "You, probably." "What's that light in the sky? I thought I'd put everything right." "That is the castle Valhalla in flames," replied Mother Earth quietly. "The high gods have all gone down. They no longer exist." Malcolm stared at her for a moment. "All of them?" "All of them. Wotan, Donna, Tyrfro, all of them. They went against the pair of the ring," said Mother Earth with a shrug, "and were proved to be weaker." "And what about the Valkyries?" Malcolm's throat was suddenly dry. "They were only manifestations of Wotan's mind," said Mother Earth. "Figments of his imagination, I suppose you could say." "But they were your daughters." "In a sense." Mother Earth polished her spectacles and put them precisely on her nose. "But what the hell? I never really got on with them. Not as people. They were too like their father, I guess, and boy, am I glad to see the back of him." "And they're all dead?" "Not dead," said Mother Earth firmly. "They just don't exist anymore. I wouldn't upset yourself over it. In fact, you should be pretty pleased with yourself. By the way, did Flossil tell you about Yes, said Malcolm. Yes, she did. He was trying to remember what Ortlind had looked like, but strangely enough, he couldn't. He felt as if he had been woken up in the middle of a strange and wonderful dream, and that all the immensely real images that had filled his mind only a moment ago were slipping away from him like water that you try and hold in your hand. "Let me assure you," said Mother Earth, "that you have in no sense killed anybody." "I don't believe I have," said Malcolm slowly. "I think I'm beginning to understand all this business after all. By the way, what happens now?" Mother Earth came as close as she had ever done to a smile. "You tell me," she said. "You're in charge now." Malcolm looked at the ring on his finger. "Right," he said. "Let's get this show on the road." Mother Earth yawned. "I'm feeling awful sleepy," she said. "I guess I'll go to bed now, if you don't mind. If I don't get my 1,000 years every age, I'm no use to anybody." "Go ahead," said Malcolm. "And thanks for all your help." "You're welcome," said Mother Earth. She was beginning to glow with a pale blue light. "I didn't do anything, really. It was all your work." Malcolm smiled and nodded. "Remember," she said, "whatever you feel like doing is probably right." She was indistinct now, and Malcolm could see a coffee table through her. "Sorry?" he asked. But she had melted away, leaving only a few sparkles behind her in the air. Malcolm shrugged his shoulders. "Never mind," he said aloud. "She's probably on the phone." Two very bedraggled ravens floated down out of the evening sky and pecked at the window pane. Their feathers were slightly singed. Malcolm opened the window, and they hopped painfully into the room. "Hello," said Malcolm. "What can I do for you?" The first raven nudged his companion, who nudged him back. "Wait, we were thinking," said the first raven, "you might be wanting a messenger service." Now you've taken over," said the second raven. "You see," said the first raven, "we used to work for the old management, and now they've been wound up." "What do you do exactly?" Malcolm asked. "We fly around the world and see what's going on," said the raven. "And then we come and tell you." "That sounds fine," said Malcolm. "You're on." The second raven dipped its beak gratefully. "I was thinking of packing it in," he said. "But now the old boss is gone." "What are you called?" Malcolm asked. "I'm Thought," said the first raven. "And this is Memory." "When can you start?" Thought seemed to hesitate, but Memory said, "Straight away." When Malcolm wasn't looking, Thought pecked his colleague hard on the shoulder. "Fine," said Malcolm. "First, go and make sure that all the damage has been put right. Then, check to see if any of the old gods are still left over." The two ravens nodded and fluttered away. When they were, as they thought, out of earshot, Thought turned to Memory and said, "What did you tell him that for?" "What?" said Memory. "About us starting straight away. I wanted a holiday." "Don't you ever think," said Memory, "this is the 20th century. They've got telephones, they've got computers, they've got fax machines. They don't need birds anymore. Nobody's indispensable, chum. You've got to show you're willing to work." "Oh, well," said Thought. "Here we go again, then." After a while, it occurred to Malcolm he hadn't seen Flosshill since the storm had died away. At the back of his mind, something told him that now Ortlind no longer existed, it was time to move on to the next available option. But he recognised that instinct and deliberately cut it out of his mind. It was the old Malcolm Fisher instinct, the one that made him fall in love and be unhappy. He was finished with all that now. He knew, of course, that there was such a thing as love, and that if you happen to come across it, as most people seem to do, it's not a thing you can avoid or that you should want to avoid. But you cannot go out and find it, because it's not that sort of creature. The phrase to fall in love, he realised, is a singularly apt one. It is something you blunder into, like a pothole, very like a pothole. In his case, however, he had had the fortune, good or bad, to blunder into a badger, not love, and since he was not accident-prone, that was probably all the accidental good fortune he was likely to get. As for Flosshill, well, since the passing of the Valkyries, she was officially one of the 3 prettiest girls in the universe, but only superficial people judge by appearances. Malcolm himself could be a prettier girl than Flosshill just by giving an order to the Tarnhelm, although it was unlikely that he should ever want to do that. The fact that she was a water spirit was neither here nor there. He himself was a hero, descended from Mother Earth and now a non-existent god, but he doubted whether that had any influence on his character or behaviour. He suddenly realised that Wotan and Erda and all the rest of them had been his relatives. That at least explained why he had been frightened of them and why he had found them so difficult to cope with. He smiled at this thought. Family is family after all, and he had just blotted most of his out. But now he was on his own, which, bearing in mind the case of his unhappy predecessor, was probably no bad thing. It would be foolish to go looking for a consort now that the world depended on him, and him alone. A troubled jail, after all, is a trouble doubled. Nevertheless, he wondered where Flosshil had got to. Everyone seemed to have drifted away, and for a moment he felt a slight panic. He sat down on the stairs and tried to think calmly. To his relief, he found this perfectly possible to do. Wotan, he reflected, had gone to one extreme, but Ingolf had gone to the other. One had been caught up in a noisy and infuriating household which had driven him quietly mad. The other had curled up in a hole and allowed his dark subconscious to permit the world to drift into the 20th century with all its unpleasant consequences. He sought a happy medium between these two extremes, and in particular considered carefully all that Mother Earth had told him. Then he got up and whistled loudly. To his surprise, nothing happened. And then he realised his mistake and went through to the drawing room. There were the two ravens huddled upon the windowsill. "Everything's fine," said Thought, as soon as Malcom had let them in. "All the gods have cleared off." "Except Logi," said Memory. "He offered us all the dead sheep we could eat if we didn't tell you he was still around, but we thought—" "Oh, I've got nothing against Logi," said Malcom. "But how come he didn't go down with all the others?" "He was a bit puzzled by that," said Memory. "Apparently there he was, surrounded by gods one minute, all on his own, feeling a right prat the next. He thinks it's down to him being a fire spirit and not a real god." "Tell him he can have his old job back if he wants it," said Malcom. "I'll tell him," said Thought, "but I think he's got other plans. He was talking about going into the wet fish business. Muttered something about he might as well do it himself before somebody did it to him. Gloomy bloke, I always thought." "Anyway," said Malcom, "did either of you see Flosshil?" "Flosshil," said Memory thoughtfully. "Can't say I did. In fact, I haven't seen any of the girls since before the Big Bang." Malcom suddenly felt very ill. "But they weren't high gods, were they? I mean, they couldn't have—" "Wouldn't have thought so," said Memory, "but you never know with those three. Very deep they were, although you wouldn't think it to look at them. But they were always mixed up with some pretty heavy things, like the Rheingold and the ring. Could be that they had to go along with the rest." Malcom sat down heavily, appalled at the thought. He couldn't understand why he was so horrified, but the idea of never seeing Flosshil again suddenly seemed very terrible. Not that he was in love with her, but he knew now he needed her very urgently. "Find her," he snapped. "Go on, move. If you're not back by dawn, I'll turn you both into clay pigeons." The ravens flapped hurriedly away into the night, and Malcom closed his eyes and groaned. He had just bumped into something, and it felt horribly disconcerting. "Oh, God," he said aloud. "Now look what I've done." Albrecht and the middle gnome looked in to say goodbye, and found Malcom in a strange mood. He seemed upset about something, but would not say what it was, and his manner seemed cold and hostile. The gnome felt sorry for him, but Albrecht seemed in a hurry to get away. "I don't like it," he said. "Something's gone wrong." "What could possibly go wrong now?" said the gnome coyly. "I don't know," said Albrecht. "But when it does, I want to be safely underground, where it won't matter so much." They walked in silence for a while, as the gnome nerved herself to ask the question that had been worrying her. "Albrecht," she said. "Yes? Don't take this the wrong way, but weren't you supposed to have forsworn love?" "Yes," said Albrecht, "but I'm allowed to change my mind, aren't I?" "But I didn't think you could, not once you'd sworn." "That was conditional on my still wanting the ring, and now that I couldn't care less about it—" "Couldn't you?" "No." He felt rather foolish, but for some reason that was all that seemed to be wrong with him. An unwanted harmony seemed to have overtaken his digestive system. "To celebrate," he said daringly, "let's go and treat ourselves to the best lunch money can buy in this god-forsaken country. I've heard about this place where you can get very palatable lobster." The nun stared at him. "Are you sure?" she said. Albrecht smiled at her fondly. "Don't you start," he said. It was nearly dawn by the time the ravens came back. They perched on the windowsill, exhausted, for they had been flying hard all night. Through the open window they could see the new Lord of Tempest sitting where he had been when they left him several hours before. He was staring at the ground, and he looked distinctly irritable.
"He's not going to like it," whispered Memory. "You tell him," replied Thought. "You're the one with the words." "But it's always got to be me," said Memory angrily. "You're the eldest. Tell him." "How do you make that out?" "Stands to reason, doesn't it? You can't have memory before thought, or you wouldn't have anything to remember. Well, could you?"
Memory clearly had right on his side, and so it was Thought who tapped gingerly on the pane and hopped into the room first. Malcom looked up, and there was something in his eyes that both ravens recognised. "Well?"
"Nothing, boss," said Thought. "We did all the rivers, oceans, seas, lakes, lochs, lagoons, bounds and waddies in the world. Even did the reservoirs and the sewers. Nothing looks like they've just...
Malcom let out a long, low mourn, and Thought stepped back nervously, expecting every moment to be turned into a small flat disc made of pitch, earmarked for certain destruction. But Malcom simply nodded, and the two birds flew thankfully away.
"Now look what you've gone and done,"
said Thought bitterly as they collapsed into a fallen tree beside the trout stream.
"You've gone and got us saddled with another bloody nutter. The last one was bad enough." "How was I to know he'd go off his rocker?" said Memory. "He looked all right to me." "You never learn, do you?" continued Thought. "We could be well away by now, but no, you've got to go and volunteer us. If we ever get out of this in one piece."
In view of the threat recently uttered by the new Lord of the Ravens, that seemed improbable. Dawn was breaking in the east, and Thought regarded it sourly.
"Look at that," he said. "No imagination, this new bloke." "Come on," said Memory. "We might as well have another go."
They lifted themselves wearily into a thermal and floated away.